A few days ago, there was an interview from the radio that caught my attention while I was driving. A woman was sharing a personal experience, and it was about when she was speaking with her child in Spanish, which, by the way, was one of the 4 languages that she knew how to speak. Another person at the playground, scolded towards them how they should be speaking in English. So I was listening to this, and I arrived at my destination as I was listening to this, but I just sat there in the car for a moment. And I don't think I was necessarily listening any longer to what the point this woman was trying to make, but this certainly wasn't the first time to process such stories in my life. Racism, immigration, American identity. These are some of the heated topics in the current climate of media, especially whenever we encounter a tragedy of hate crime. A question emerged within me as I was sitting in that car. What does it mean to live a life of faith in today's world? What is faith in today's world? Obviously, faith is a word that we hear a lot, and we use it a lot. The word faith is defined with many different meanings just within the scripture. And if I ask any of you today, right now, what does the word faith mean to you, you'll probably be able to give me some kind of a definition based on your own personal experience. So we're going to reflect together on the words from the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews over the next 2 weeks. And Hebrews chapter 11 is about faith. Faith. Some people even call this chapter the Hall of Fame of the heroes of faith. The Hall of Fame, as the author lists down the names of the people of faith in our history. And by looking at how the writer talks about these names, we might learn and understand the essential characteristics of faith. And the first part of faith relates to having a sense of hoped for goals. Hope for goals. For Abraham, in verse 8, there was the place he would later receive as his inheritance. That's for Abraham. And for Sarah, there was a promised offspring. And then the list goes on in that chapter. By their faith, they kept their hope for goals. Hyun and I, my wife and I, as most of loving parents do, we have some hope for goals for our children. And one of them is that we hope that they will grow up bilingual. Not just because it will be a valuable asset for them when they're looking for jobs, but not only even because it will be a very essential tool for them when they come to an age when they begin to search for their identity, cultural identity, but also because we believe and we have faith that it will enrich their experience as citizens of this land of rich diversity. So that's the reason why I try to speak to them in Korean, especially in public, as much as possible, either when I'm dropping them off in front of their school in the morning or when playing in the playground, because I want them to have a sense of confidence of who they are, even in front of their friends, and to teach them the culture that embraces diversity. Perhaps that's the goal, the hoped-for goal for me, cultivating the culture of embrace. That's one example of having a hoped-for goal through faith. So what is the goal that God is planting in you through your faith, through your family, through your church, through your country? But there is a second part to this definition of faith. So there's a second part as we define what faith means. And I believe this is what makes being faithful different from merely a purpose-driven or a goal-driven person, right? This brings us a little bit deeper as we reflect on what goals we might have. And that is when the author highlights the reality not apparent to our human senses. So here are some examples just from that chapter 11 of Hebrews. In verse 3, it says, "By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible." That's verse 3. How about Abraham in verse 10? It says, "He was looking forward to the city with foundations." And this comes to the climax when the author says in verse 16 that the people were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. That's in verse 16. And of course, the famous Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, which defines faith for us. It says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." That's verse 1 of chapter 11. And one of the commentators reread the sentence as this: "Faith is not the guarantee of what will happen, but it is the unfolding of what is happening." Faith is not the guarantee of what will happen, but it is the unfolding of what is happening. So if we go back to the first part of faith, to have hopes and goals through faith, especially in the world we live in today, it's not just to hope for the world where it will one day become a better place for everyone to live in, but it is the assurance of God who is already in action. Faith is the unfolding of what is already happening. It's a new sense of reality. Abraham's faith, Sarah's faith, Enoch, and Noah in the earlier verses in this very same chapter, their goals weren't just about the transitory things of this world, but in the long, hoped-for, redemptive goal of God. Faith is focused on God's reality of grace, promises, and salvation, even beyond our tribal nature of humanity, even beyond our survival instincts, stimulated by our fears and anxieties. Faith in God allows us to go beyond and deeper than that. So for the next few Sundays, we're going to continue to talk about faith. We're going to reflect on that. Next week, we're going to talk more about the dynamic between seen and the unseen nature of faith. And then the week after, we'll talk about faithful living in the face of opposition. And then we'll conclude the series by reflecting on having patience and endurance when living a life of faith. But to me, before we go into all of that, in the deepest ground for me personally, the part of faith that hits me at the heart is the relationship between the words faith and migrancy. Faith and migrancy. Abraham leaving their home to follow God's call. The Israelites crossing the Red Sea towards the promised land. Young family of Jesus fleeing from persecution of Herod to the foreign land. Many missionaries and evangelists in our Christian history leaving their families to spread the love of Christ. This migrant nature that is closely tied to the word faith. It tells me that faith is a movement. Faith is an action. Faith is risk-taking. Faith is being excited for newness. Faith is expanding what diversity means. Faith is unfolding of God's reality. This August, this month, marks the 11th year for me to be in the U.S. And I asked myself, did I ever possibly imagine where I am now, 11 years ago, when I got off that plane with my guitar and 2 large bags? No. I didn't imagine if I would be thinking about my child's identity searching possibilities. I wasn't thinking about that. But here I am. Not just in a geographical sense, but all the experiences and growth through reflections during those years which define who I am today. And I'm sure that you all have your own versions of that story of faith. Once again, faith is the unfolding of what is happening now. The divine challenge to all of us is to keep trusting in God's happenings. No matter how much discouragements, no matter how much disappointments, no matter how much dislikes, and all the other disruptions in our lives, which makes our vision unclear and even invisible at some times. Our role, our sole role, is to claim that faith here and now. Because God has been and is being in action right now, moving, migrating, ever expanding. And for that grace, we give thanks to God. And I pray that each of our days will be filled with excitement and joy as we unfold little by little the divine purpose that God has planted in each one of us today. Amen.